Hey everyone, welcome back to Engelbard Gaming. I've got my first utterly pointless comparison of 2023 for you, and it's of a true classic in the shooter or shmup genre. I'll be taking a look at the arcade version of R-Type, along with its port to the PC Engine CD. That's right, there's a PC Engine CD version, did you know that? Well, you do now. So as usual, here's a look at the specs of the hardware while I tell you a little bit about the game itself. IREM originally released R-Type into the arcades in 1987, and it was pretty much an instant classic. It brought forth ideas, mechanics, and themes that will become staples of the genre for years going forward. The game contained 8 levels of intense shooting action that was heavily memorization-based, which means, as long as you could remember things and had decent reflexes, you could eventually make progress in this tough-as-nails game. It had 8 levels, and, well, 2 of them were sort of half levels, but still, it had 8 complete levels, and getting through them took some work. It looked great, it played great, and the music ranged from to pretty good. Now, a fun thing about R-Type that you may not know is that in the US, the game was distributed by Nintendo in the arcade. So you could go play Nintendo R-Type in the arcade, and then come home and play R-Type on your Sega Master System. Weren't the late 80s and early 90s a weird and wonderful time? Anywho, the following year, that's 1988 for those of you keeping score, R-Type came home to the PC Engine in Japan. But there was a mighty big catch. You see, there was a strict requirement on the capacity of HuCards at the time. So R-Type was too large to fit on the largest HuCards that were manufactured, so you had to split it into 2 games. In Game 1, R-Type 1, you had levels 1 through 4. In Game 2, R-Type Part 2, you had levels 5 through 8. Hardly an ideal situation. Now, aside from that, the game was an excellent port and one of the best ways to play R-Type at home during that era. And when the game was released in the US a year later in 1989, it was thankfully merged onto a single turbo chip the way it was intended to always be. Now, what you may not know, in 1991, 3 years after the release of the original version of R-Type for the PC Engine, they released a CD version of the game called R-Type Complete. Now, this was a Japan-only release, and it contained all the levels on a single CD, it added cutscenes, and even Redbook audio music. And, well, that's the version we're going to look at today. Gameplay-wise, it's pretty much identical to the card-based version. So do these additions make it the version of R-Type to get from the 16-bit era? Well, watch the comparison to find out. Alright, recording methodology for this one. I did use save states at the start of each level to make sure I could keep the games in sync as best as humanly possible. I did also remove the cutscenes that play in the middle of gameplay. They come up every 2 levels in the CD version, and they add like a total of 10 minutes to the game overall for looking at all the cutscenes. I respect your time too much for that, so I'll show a little bit of them at the end of the video. And I also slightly shortened a little bit of load time in the CD version here and there, again to keep the gameplay in sync as best as I could. Alright, let's get on with it. And we're underway. So, one thing you can see is that they added this little intro to the PC Engine CD version of R-Type that is quite reminiscent of the start from R-Type 2. And just wait till you see what the ship looks like when it takes off, and you'll see exactly what I mean. And this is already way too long in my opinion. And when I press start, I want to start playing. I don't want to watch this. There you go. Look familiar? Alright, so to start with, I'm going to sound like a broken record on a few things. As usual, I'll have to point out that the PC Engine does not have a second background layer, so we don't have any true parallax scrolling in this game. So we can see that in this first level, the starfield in the arcade version is way more complex than the starfield in the PC Engine version. One other thing I'll point out is that the graphics are a little wider on the PC Engine, and that's because the way that they seemingly just imported a lot of the arcade graphics into this one with a different resolution. And another thing that is kind of annoying is that, this game on the PC Engine scrolls up and down for you to see the entire playfield. And while it's not too big a deal in some of these early levels, it really does hamper the gameplay a bit as you get on to later levels like levels 6 and 7. Now, I will also point out that the scrolling speed is slightly faster on PC Engine CD, so you will see me occasionally having to pause that version to allow the arcade version to catch up to it. Now, another sort of oddity that I'll point out here is that in the PC Engine CD version, they didn't really change any of the assets from the Turbo Chip version of the game that we saw in the US. So, it's basically just that version of the game thrown onto a CD. Now, the downside to this is that there are some different tiles, or textures that exist in the arcade version that they never tried to replicate on the CD version, even though they would have had plenty of room to do that. So even the background patterns that we see here are different in both versions, and the foreground things have different elements. And as we come up to the boss, let me just squeeze in that the CD music is kind of terrible in level 1, but the boss music is alright. You're going to hear the arcade version here. We'll play the boss music when we get to the next boss. I'll wait till probably level 4 because that one's long enough to actually hear it. But just from a general quality standpoint, the PC Engine port of R-Type was already good, and the CD version is still good. When it comes to the fundamentals, it does a lot of things really well, and the gameplay is very close to the arcade original. Alright, and as we begin level 2, we can see another parallax scrolling casualty here. So we just have a single background layer on PC Engine. They didn't bother to try and simulate parallax scrolling, even with faux parallax scrolling in any way, shape, or form. And not only that, but the pattern in the background is much simpler on PC Engine CD than it is in the arcade game, which has quite a bit more variety in it. Aside from that, when it comes to the enemies and timing and everything, they're pretty much spot on in this PC Engine CD port, much as they were in the original HuCard and Turbo Chip ports of the game. I'll add once again here that the CD music in this level is just weird. I don't know what they were thinking with this soundtrack. It is definitely not something that fits in R-Type. Alright, here is our iconic big long stone snake thing. They did a pretty nice job on the TurboGrafx/PC Engine versions. There's a little bit of flicker on it, but it's not too bad, especially considering how many segments that, make up that thing. And now we're heading into Boss 2. Aside from some shading differences, this looks pretty close in both versions of the game. But man, look at all the flicker going on now on the PC Engine CD version. Whew. If I had a different weapon, that would have lasted a lot longer, and you would have seen an insane flicker show. Now, in the PC Engine CD version, we would ordinarily see a cutscene here, which I have removed to respect your time. I'll show a little bit of it at the end while I'm, giving you my concluding thoughts on this. So here is the infamous third level of R-Type, in which the entire level is just an assault on this giant battleship. On the PC Engine CD version, much like the Turbo Chip and HuCard versions, they managed to include the little bit of background that's from the arcade version, and I actually prefer the colors used on the PC Engine for this one. I think this area actually looks a little bit better than the arcade original. It's not quite so muted. So bravo to them on this version. And yeah, this ship is recreated in exacting detail on this. I mean, if you look at it, every line is pretty much accounted for in the PC Engine port. Now, some of the way that the ring laser hits some of these fireball shooting cannons at the end is a little different in the PC Engine CD version, but it's so close it's barely even worth mentioning. What is kind of worth mentioning is that the cloud pattern is a little bit different for the parts at the top and bottom of the screen in each version of the game. They are not identical. Just look at the edges there and you'll see what I mean. Alright, now we go into level 4. And unfortunately, on the PC Engine, they just did away with the star field entirely in this level, and we just have this plain, boring black background. Now, you can get away with that on 8-bit systems that are purely 8-bit, don't have any 16-bit components, but come on, guys, you could have had a star field here even if it was just scrolling at the same speed as the foreground. Just something would have helped a little bit. Once again, we're pausing to allow the arcade one to catch up. And here we are. If you're familiar with R-Type, you're going to enjoy this next part where I completely annihilate all the little tiles here that make up the end section of this level. So when you first start this game, you're often going to end up in this area not powered up, and it's really hard to get through all these trails that the snakes leave behind, and all these little dot things that make up the tiles in the foreground here. But in both versions, watch as I utterly annihilate pretty much all of it. Now, a fun little factoid here is in the Sega Master System version of the game. It's in this area up at the top where you can sort of back into a secret exclusive level that's only available in that version of the game. So we can't see that here. Oh well, maybe I'll look at that version another time. And we are approaching the boss of this level. And once again, they've done a really nice job on the PC Engine CD version, which, they had done a really nice job in the original PC Engine Turbo Chip version. PC Engine and Turbo Chip versions, I should say. So I had a real smooth takedown in the PC Engine port. I kind of flubbed up the arcade one a little bit, but not too badly, so there we are. Now, once again on the PC Engine CD port, we would have a cutscene here. So I've cut that out. Here we are in level 5. Which, hey, they've simulated some parallax, at least with just a faux parallax layer using some raster effects. Basically, they've split the screen into a couple of different parts. Why are things blank in that row of mush in the background on the PC Engine version? Because it needs to scroll up and down a little bit, and it can't ever overlap with those flower things. But as you can see, other than that, they've done a really nice job on this level. And this is the one that most closely, I feel, represents the arcade game at this point. Well, man, there was a lot of flicker there with a lot of stuff on screen, wasn't there? And yeah, there are occasional bouts of severe flicker in this version of the game, there's no question about that. But still, I've got to give it to them. This version, the PC Engine CD version and the original PC Engine and TurboGrafx versions, very well done for level 5. I wish every level I'd come across just as great as this one had, but I understand the limitations that prevented that on some of them. And again, I want to stress that, R-Type is great on this platform, there's no question about it. So don't think I'm talking down about R-Type. There's just a lot of things about this CD version that aren't as good as the chip version, if you ask me. And watch as I completely annihilate this boss on PC Engine, and it doesn't take too much longer in the arcade version. And man, that PC Engine CD version's music again, just completely inappropriate for the game. It just sounded awful. Now, here is one time where I will be completely complimentary. The music in this level on the PC Engine CD version sounds really nice, and this is probably the best song in the entire game in this version, in the PC Engine CD port. Now once again, they've done away with the very weird parallax effect from the arcade game, in which the foreground layer scrolls by slower than the background layer. Some people may even prefer this one on PC Engine because it doesn't have that weird sort of disorienting effect. And yeah, you can destroy those things if you hit the little sensors on the fronts of them. Not always easy to do. There's a couple of different ways to handle this part, but this is my favorite. I just like to worm my way into the top shelf there and take out the myriad of enemies that just spawn up above you. You could also just fly down the middle, or you could throw your, force up there and try and take them out that way. There's a lot of different options. Well, not a lot, I guess. There's a few different options. One other difference I'll point out between the two games here is if you look at the tiles that make up the background, they are quite different in the two versions of the game. So there are no sections I've found that are basically an exact match between the background on the PC Engine CD version and the arcade original. And now we're up to this boss area. Again, you can see where we've stopped. The background is a lot different in the two versions of the game. So in the arcade version, this boss is just surviving a bunch of these things, and that's it, and then the level ends. In the PC Engine version, we're going to see something a little bit different. It's got an actual boss that they added exclusively to this version of the game. And here we're moving on to it now on the PC Engine, and you'll see that the arcade version just stops there, because that's the end of the level. Here on PC Engine CD, we've got to take down a boss before we finish the level. It also kind of reminds me of one from R-Type 2, just looking at the design of it. Again, we've got to deal with some flicker on this part, pretty obvious in a lot of areas. Getting a nice long listen to the PC Engine boss music now, and that's okay. It's not too bad. It's one of the better songs in this version of the game. And there we are. Only 2 levels left. So here, on PC Engine CD, there would be another cutscene, which I have removed. Oh, and that boss is in the HuCard and TurboChip versions of the game as well, by the way. So here we are in level 7. Once again, we lose the parallax scrolling from the arcade version of R-Type. And the backgrounds are a little bit simplified compared to the arcade original. As you go through this level, a whole bunch of parts of the foreground there explode, and if you're caught up in those explosions, you die. If you've played this game before, you may or may not be aware that you can actually destroy this giant thing that approaches from behind, which I already took out on the PC Engine CD version. And this level, while incredibly short, if you don't know what you're doing, man, is it hard. The first version of R-Type I ever played was on the Amiga, and holy cow, did I die a lot trying to get past this level. I mean, it probably took me weeks to finally finish it. I kept making it up to here with no problem, and then just could not finish it. This part right here is where I used to always get stuck. Once again, I will point out that the music in the CD version is pretty much garbage in this level, which is appropriate considering this level ends in garbage. So we're gonna see a boss here, and let's just say that I'm kind of surprised that George Lucas never sued. Look at that. Remind you of anything? Sure, it's a little more robotic, but still, you know, garbage, little thing sticking its head up at you. Kinda Star Wars vibey, don't you think? Anyway, it doesn't matter. He's dead now. Let's move on. So now we're going up to the game's final level, and I've decided to give you a little treat. I don't even really fire a shot in the entire level until I get to the boss. So here we get these weird alien baby embryo things, and yeah, as long as you've got, you know, your main force bit all the way powered up and you've got the two, you know, side bits, pretty much none of these things can touch you if you hang out at the back of the screen. You just gotta make sure to avoid the swirl when it comes out. Now, while the music isn't exactly great in the arcade version here, again, it's just kind of weird and bad in the CD version. Another one of those instances where I just don't know what they were thinking. And yeah, this is all this level is, by the way. You just basically sit still and get assaulted by weird alien babies until you reach the boss. The easiest way to take out this boss is to launch your force straight into his face. Now, one thing I'll point out here that might not be obvious is that the boss isn't even fully on screen in the PC Engine CD version. He doesn't fit because of the difference in resolution, and they wanted to give you more space to move around to make this fight more similar to the arcade version. What's funny, and what I don't show you here, is you can kind of just hang out at the back of the screen exactly in the middle and just shoot, and most of the time you can do that without anything ever touching you. I wanted to make sure that I actually beat the boss and didn't die because I was mispositioned, so I didn't do that here. So here we are, we're done on the PC Engine version, and we're done on the arcade version. Now, if you have the American Turbo Chip version of the game, you will see an ending that pretty much matches the arcade version almost exactly, except it fixes some weird typos or grammatical mistakes you'll see in the text here. On the PC Engine CD, we've got a full semi-animated ending, which I'm going to show you the entire thing this time. It's also nice because you'll get to hear the first level music, and you can hear just how awful it actually is in the PC Engine version. They play it during the credits. And we're going to be here for a little while. We've probably got at least another 2 or 3 minutes left while this ending plays out. So while we're doing that, why don't I tell you a few fun R-Type facts that you may or may not know. So I mentioned earlier that the first version of R-Type I ever played was on the Commodore Amiga. Now what's very interesting about that version of the game is it was made by Factor 5, the company that made the Turrican games. But what's even better is why it was made by Factor 5. And allow me to explain this. You see, Factor 5 had made a game that was similar to R-Type called Catechus. And when I say similar to R-Type, I mean really similar to R-Type. So similar that it was pulled off shelves because it was so similar. And part of the condition, apparently, for Factor 5 being allowed to continue and not get sued and tied up with more legal trouble was that they would then have to develop the Amiga version of R-Type. And that is how they came to be the ones who ported the game to the home computer. Weird, right? An even weirder Factor 5 story is that they made a game called Great Giana Sisters for the Commodore 64. Back in the day, this had been modified to include a sprite that looked like Mario from Super Mario Bros. But even before then, that one was pulled off the shelf because Nintendo sued, and it was way too similar to Super Mario Bros., which it was really similar to Super Mario Bros. So Factor 5 was involved with this sort of shenanigan twice. Anyway, here you are hearing the Level 1 music from R-Type, and man is it bad. That awful speech that's in it, just everything about it is just awful. I don't know what they were thinking. I've said that a lot of times during this. I don't know what they were thinking. The US TurboGrafx version of the game that contains the entire game on a single turbo chip is better than the CD version, and feels more like the arcade original. I'll elaborate a bit more now. Alright, so there we are, a complete playthrough comparison of the arcade and PC Engine CD versions of R-Type. Is R-Type Complete the ultimate way to experience the game from the 16-bit era of consoles? No, it's not, unfortunately. The Red Book audio music just doesn't fit. A lot of it sounds like elevator music, and the genres they went with for the songs are super weird. Aside from that, we're adding load time to a game that originally had none, and just interrupting the game every 2 levels with cutscenes completely destroys the flow of the gameplay. So it's by no means a bad game, but the best way to experience R-Type? Not even close. The Turbo Chip version in the US that contains the complete game is a much better way to play R-Type than R-Type Complete. You know what would have been nice for R-Type Complete and would have made the game worthwhile? If they would have included R-Type 2 on the disc instead of a bunch of pointless cutscenes that nobody cared about. Oh well, live and learn, right? Anyway, what are your thoughts now that you've seen the complete game of R-Type Complete on PC Engine CD? Is this something you ever saw before? What's your favorite home port of R-Type? There's about 1 million ports of this game, so I'll probably come back and do some other version comparisons in the not-too-distant future. Are there any in particular that you'd especially like to see? Tell me all about it in the comments. And that'll do it for this video, my retro gaming friends. If you enjoyed the video, please toss it a like and share it online somewhere. If you haven't yet, hey, subscribe, hit that notification bell so you'll never miss another video. Aside from that, if you want to support the shenanigans I get up to here, you can now do that either on Patreon or Ko-fi. Links follow at the end of the video and are down in the description. With that, I'll say thanks for watching, and see me later.